Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. A warm welcome to this HSC SOR Masterclass, which is on Christianity, Environmental Ethics. My name is Andy Martin. I'm an Education Officer who works for Sydney Catholic Schools. I'm broadcasting today from the Sydney Catholic Schools building, which is on George Street in Sydney. This building is built on land that was stolen from the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I acknowledge the Gadigal and I acknowledge all Indigenous Australians. I acknowledge that their dreaming was, is and always will be connected to this place. I pledge to work with all Australians for lasting reconciliation. So today, folks, we'll be talking about environmental ethics. If at any stage you have any questions, please just type those into the chat. I'll do my best to answer them, and if I can't, I'll email your REC later on with a response. So welcome, let's get underway. So the game plan for today is that we'll begin with looking at the syllabus, which is a good starting point and tell us exactly what we need to do. I'll go over some learning intentions and success criteria so you know what we're setting out to do and how you'll know if you can do it or not. I have a look at how to define environmental ethics, which is something that will be useful to you if you are writing a 20-mark response. And also, I mean, it's just useful insofar as it will help your thinking in this area. After that, we'll look at some Christian teachings, some ethical teachings, which pertain to environmental ethics. Then we're going to look at how those teachings are lived. So the lived expression of those teachings by individuals, by the Christian community, how they apply to environmental issues. We'll take a particular look at climate change today. You see a great photo here from the climate change protest, which took part maybe the year before last. All right, so straight in. So from the syllabus, here's our outcomes. I've identified over on the right the key skills. So this is what you need to be able to do. You need to be able to describe, to explain, which means to show cause and effect, explain why things happen, and analyze and evaluate, which means to find relationships between things and make judgments about how important things are. You can see the related outcomes there on the left. So in terms of this particular part of the syllabus, there's a couple of things which I always draw my class's attention to. One is that it's actually quite simple. We are simply describing and explaining Christian ethical teachings on environmental ethics. Now notice there in that little box where the syllabus is excerpted, it says bioethics, environmental ethics and sexual ethics. Well, obviously you only do the one of those. So don't confuse your answers by trying to do more than one. You just focus on environmental ethics only. And I also emphasize just that last sentence of the little blurb at the top, or the last two sentences. One says that Christianity is a living religious tradition. Now, what this means is it's useful to people today in the real world. It's a tradition that is still alive and helps people with the problems of today. This is why ethics is such a great area to study, because it's all about how I engage with the modern world. The other thing just to note is we need to talk about the whole tradition of Christianity. Now, I know in recent years, Catholicism, Pope Francis, this is a big focus for Pope Francis. He's written an encyclical about it, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. Don't get sucked into just writing about Catholicism. You need to find a range of examples that illustrate the breadth of the tradition. I've also put a little bit more detail in what you need to be able to do over on the right of the screen. So to provide main features of the teachings, to demonstrate with examples, to show relationships and evaluate things. All right, so here's what we'd like to do. Describe and explain Christian ethical teachings on environmental ethics and demonstrate that Christianity is, as I said, a living religious tradition by applying these teachings to a range of contemporary issues. So our success criteria. Can you do these things? Can you write a definition of environmental ethics? Name and define 3 Christian ethical teachings regarding the environment. Quote evidence to support these teachings. Outline contemporary environmental ethical issues. I reckon you could do that right now, actually. Could you outline climate change? If you could, then you've already achieved success criteria number 4. Explain and evaluate how the teachings of Christianity can help adherents to take actions on those issues, and express all of that in some sample answers from section 2 and 3 in the HSC. Is that all okay? Like I said, any questions, chuck them in the chat and I'll do my best. But for now, let's look at what environmental ethics is. So it's a branch of ethics pertaining obviously to the natural environment, its value, and human beings' relationship with it. If you liked, that's the kind of background information which can help add detail to an extended response only. You would never use that in a short answer. Look at that middle bit there. Environmental ethics considers the environment's intrinsic and instrumental value. Now, I'll just speak about that. Intrinsic value means how is the environment valuable in itself? So just because it is, just because it exists, how is the environment valuable? How is it worthwhile? Does it have value? How is it worth something? Instrumental value, on the other hand, is value because I can use it for something. So I am against air pollution because I need clean air to breathe. I am for sustainable farming practices because I need food to eat. I am for the conscientious care of the environment because I care about future generations. Well, they're still people, so that's an instrumental value. That distinction, if you don't 100% get it, that's okay, but it's going to help to add detail to some of the teachings which I'm going to talk about later. Intrinsic value, it's valuable just because it is. Instrumental value, it's valuable because I can use it. All right, and I've put some issues down the bottom there. So some examples such as climate change, pollution, and animal extinction fall within the field of environmental ethics. So this whole business of dynamic living religion, it's useful. Christianity is useful in the world, it's useful to adherents today because it helps them grapple with questions that are relevant today. So should we protect and restore the environment because without it we cannot live? Should we do it for future generations? Should we do it because the environment itself has intrinsic value, because it's precious? Whose problem is it? Is it my problem? Is it the Australian Prime Minister's problem? Is it the wealthy nation's problem? Is it the big polluters' problem? Is it corporations' problem? Whose responsibility is it? And how do we know? How urgently do we have to act? What are the consequences if we don't? So the religious tradition of Christianity is going to help answer all of these questions. It's going to give a particular perspective which only it can give. Alrighty, so every time I teach this, most recently in schools last year, I do it a slightly different way. So this way, my teachings which this year, my teachings which I'm looking at, or the teachings which I'm looking at, are that God is the creator of the world, that creation itself is good, that God is revealed by creation, the nature of God is revealed by creation, stewardship, which is everyone's favorite, and another one which I love to use and my students love to write about, called love of neighbour. So those are the 5 teachings of Christianity which pertain to environmental ethics, which I'm going to put some detail on for you today. If your teachers have got others which they've used with you, or other different ways of expressing these, absolutely run with those, but I present these for your interest and information. So this idea that God is the creator. So we Christians believe in the Trinity, right? A triune God of 3 persons who are in fact one God. God the Father is the creator, Jesus the Son is the Redeemer, and the Holy Spirit makes things holy, is the sanctifier, fills things with grace. So God the Father's identity as the creator, that's an important teaching for environmental ethics. But equally important is the notion of the Trinity, which is that Jesus, the Son, and the Holy Spirit were joined in the loving creative action of God from the very beginning of time. So how do we know all of that? Well, the evidence for it is in Scripture. So what you'll need to do, and this presentation, like all of our things, always shared on the Mission and Identity channels, and the recording of this is shared on the channel, so you can come back afterwards and pick your favourite quotes, or you can quickly write them down now. You need some evidence, folks. So you could use something like what it says in the Psalms. "O Lord, how manifold are your works." That means how plentiful they are. "In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. When you send your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the earth." You could use this quote: "All things are created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." That would be a good one if you were also studying Paul, because that's a quote from Paul in his letter to the Colossians, and gives you a chance to look at how the different traditions go together. This is one that will ring in your ears. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God." Now, in that context, Word refers to Jesus Christ. This is what I was talking about before, about how Jesus was involved in this identity of God as the creator. Through him, all things were made. All right, now we also need to look toward the tradition to find support for these teachings. So what does that mean? That means writings of the different leaders and hierarchical bodies of the different denominations of Christianity. And again, here you need a range. So I've put a quote from Laudato Si at the top, which you could use an excerpt from. I love that. I'll come back to it in a second. But down the bottom, I've put a quote from the Uniting Church, from the Synod of the Uniting Church in New South Wales, ACT, a very new quote, which says, the bit you might be able to use: "We believe that God, as the creator of the universe, calls humanity into a relationship of mutuality and interdependence with the creation." So God creates and calls humans into relationship with that creation. We believe that God as the creator. That's what the teaching is that I'm talking about, God as the creator of the universe. The one above from Laudato Si refers to God's love. I think that's an argument which you can use in your answers. So God's love is the fundamental moving force in creation, in all creation things. That's probably enough of the quote to memorize, but don't you love this next bit here? "The fleeting life of the least of beings, the smallest insect, is the object of God's love, and in its few seconds of existence, God enfolds it with his affection." There's a beautiful statement about the nature of God and the relationship of God with God's creation. All right, so how do you use all of that? Well, structure your thinking. You could try structuring your thinking along these lines. If you can write a definition, follow it with some terminology, some sacred text quotes, and then finish with implications for adherence. This kind of structure is going to be useful to you in section 2 of the exam. This would work for, say, an 8-mark response, something like this. If the question led you in this path, you could use something like this. If you're using this information for a shorter response, you'd have to tailor it. For a longer response, you'd have to adapt it into more succinct paragraphs. But for now, here it is. So my definition: a teaching of Christianity is that God, the Father, is the creator of heaven and earth. Just bang, state what it is. The other persons of the Trinity, Jesus, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, were joined in the loving creative action of God from the beginning of time. I think it's fine to use simple language like that when you're defining your teaching. Then explain how it's supported by Scripture. And again, do this very simply. Feel free to do it very simply. This teaching is supported by Scripture. In the Psalms of the Christian Old Testament, it states, in wisdom you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. In the New Testament, Paul writes that all things were created by him and for him. Now, those two teachings would probably be enough for most paragraphs, but I've gone on here in case there's more here that you can use. The Gospel of John helps to explain that Jesus was with God in the beginning and that through him all things were made. I've even included a little bit of that Pope Francis quote that I read for you before. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis writes, God's love is the fundamental moving force in all created things. Now, in a standard paragraph, as I said before, to support your teaching, you probably only need 2 of those pieces of evidence. So you have to choose 2 that represent the whole tradition of Christianity. Okay, so what? What's the implication of adherence? The teaching that God created the world helps adherents to understand that it is through God's loving will that all of creation comes into being. For Christians, it's true at the beginning of time, it's true today, through the consistent renewal of life of the world. It's a deliberate act born out of love. Adherents acknowledge that God is the foundation of all life by, so there's a cause and effect sentence, by is the hinge word, showing respect and care for the natural world. That last paragraph there, that's the so what part. That's going to be very important that you can communicate that in your, well, that you're sound with that in your thinking and you can communicate that in your answers. So, just for yourself now, check your outcomes. Look at the blue box over on the right. Can you describe that ethical teaching that God is the creator? So can you give the main features of it? Probably you can. It's pretty straightforward. Can you explain it by giving some examples that show that it's founded on sacred texts? We might not, you have to do some work before you can do that, but you can see the information is there. It's your job to memorize enough supporting evidence. Then, as I said before, that last part of the response from before, where you're showing the impact, the so what factor. What's the relationship between that teaching and an environmental issue? I'll do that later as well when I talk about climate change. And how does that teaching influence the life of adherents? That's what I tried to do at the bottom of the page just before. That's teaching number 1. This one is a related teaching. You could combine them if you like, but I like to keep them separate because I think they both make a slightly different point. The second teaching is that creation itself is good. So remember I was talking before about intrinsic worth and instrumental worth. It's good just because it is versus it's good because I can use it. Well, Christianity teaches that the world is good just because it is. Now I can see that someone's, just as I lose my cursor here, someone is trying perhaps to raise a hand to answer a question. We're not going to do that, but if you would like, you can type a question in the chat. So if you put anything in the chat, I'll do my best to answer it. So the value of creation goes beyond how it can be used, as I was saying. It's not just because we need it for food or shelter or whatever. In itself, it's of immeasurable value. All right. Oh, Min wants to know where we can get access to this lecture's recording. Min, I put the link for that on the very first slide today, which I'll put up again at the end. The other way is that all of these recordings get placed on the Mission and Identity YouTube channel, and you can absolutely access that. Your teachers have got the address for it. In fact, the address for it is on the same page that had the link for this session. All right. Let's talk about some of the evidence there. So God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. Now remember, in the Genesis account, you would have read this if you went through Catholic schools. You've been reading that Genesis account for a lot of years now, since you were little. And at the end of each day of creation, God says it was good. God looks at God's creation and says it was good. At the end of the 7 days of creation, God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. In the Psalms, the Lord rejoices in all his works. In a letter of Paul, again, if you're studying Paul, for everything created by God is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it's received with thanksgiving. From the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, this guy, by the way, folks, just jot down his name right now and look him up in your own time, Patriarch Bartholomew. He's the leader of the International Orthodox Church, that part of Christianity, and he's the Green Patriarch. He's an absolute legend when it comes to environmental issues. You can get some great supporting paragraph from some of the things that Patriarch Bartholomew has said about the environment over the years. All right, so let's put all of that together. I'll give you a second just to read my definition there. Yeah, it makes sense, right? The value of creation goes beyond how it can be used by humans. In itself, it's a thing of immeasurable valuable. And a Christian would believe part of that is because God willed it into being out of love. Teachings found in Scripture. So this is how you truncate and use your quotes. After creating the world, God saw everything he had made, indeed it was very good. And the Lord rejoices in all his works. Now, those two pieces of evidence are probably enough, but I've gone on. In the New Testament, Paul writes that everything created by God is good. Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew adds the voice of tradition, explaining that indifference towards the destruction of the very good creation is offence against God and a violation of his commandments. Heaps of evidence there. Mixture, again, of scripture and tradition going across the whole diversity of Christianity. All right, now pay attention to this part. The teaching that creation itself is intrinsically good helps Christians to, I've used this word, okay, to look beyond an anthropocentric view of the natural world. Anthropology, you might have heard of, means a study of humans. Anthropocentric means we put ourselves at the middle. So nature is important because I need it. Nature is important because future generations need it. Nature is important because I need to take care of it for my children. It's putting humans in the middle. It's not the only answer. And Christianity does present that answer, but also presents that nature is important just because it is, because it was brought into being by God who loves the world. So I expand there. Such a view would suggest that creation is of value because it's a thing that can or must be used by humans. But the danger is that it treats the natural world as a commodity, something that's useful because you need it. The teaching that creation itself is intrinsically good helps Christians to look beyond that view I was talking about, that human-centered, that anthropocentric view, and instead to respect the natural world unconditionally. Unconditional love is something that Christians talk about a lot. All right, so that's a bit sophisticated. That's the hardest one conceptually to get. The rest of them are really easy. This one's straightforward. You look at who among believers didn't look at a beautiful sunrise as the people on Bondi Beach on this morning were experiencing and think, wow, there probably is a God after all. So creation reveals the nature of God. This is linked, do you remember in year 11 you studied the principal beliefs of Christianity? One of them was revelation. Now, Christians believe that God is revealed to the world, is made known to the world through the person of Jesus Christ, through the words and actions of Jesus Christ that are recorded in the scriptures and lived by the different denominations. But adherents also understand that we can learn about God through what God has made. In fact, this is one of the, this is a digression, but for Thomas Aquinas, who's a famous Catholic theologian, this was one of the proofs that God has to exist because someone needed to start all of this creation. Someone needed to start all of this activity. Right, so here's some evidence you can use. I love this one from Paul. That top one is Paul again. If you're studying Paul, heaps of overlap here. God's invisible qualities, so things that we can't see, have been clearly seen and understood from what has been made. So we understand the invisible qualities of God by God's creation. Jesus talks a lot about nature. So one of the things that Jesus said is learn from the way the wild flowers grow. This is in a passage where he's telling the disciples not to worry so much about things. Wildflowers do not work or spin. I tell you, not even Solomon in all of his splendor, Solomon was one of the great kings, in all of his splendor was clothed like one of these wildflowers. So he's talking about the splendor of nature and encouraging the disciples to look at it, see God, and find peace. Do you remember the mustard seed parable? The kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in the field. Again, Jesus is using nature imagery to make God, to reveal God to people. All right, so how do we apply that teaching? Christianity teaches that creation reveals the nature of God. The principle of belief of revelation refers to the ways that God's nature and will are made known in the world. We can learn, Christians can learn about God through what God has made. Some evidence in the middle, which I won't read again to you, but then the implication at the end. The teaching that God is revealed in creation. Why is it important? Helps Christians to understand that creation is good. And so the creator must also be good. God's majesty is revealed through the wonders of creation. It's like I was talking about with the sunset before. Adherents are called to recognize this majesty by showing respect for the natural world. So what? Adherents should be respectful of the natural world because it reflects God. Jesus' use of all of this natural world imagery helps us to understand something about God and helps us to understand also, wow, if the natural world is showing us something about God, then we need to be careful with it. All right. Do you remember the bushfires from the other year? That's what Sydney looked like in the smoky haze. So that's not a very good example of this next teaching, which is stewardship. This is probably the number one teaching that students write about. It's conceptually very simple. So here we go. Humans have a special God-given responsibility as stewards of the created world. Bang, easy. Here's the support. There's always a lot of discussion over, see that first quote, the use of the word rule. Let us make man, it's gendered, they mean humankind, in our image, and let them rule over all the earth and all the creatures that move along the ground. Now you have to understand rule in the terms of the Hebrew scriptures from which this comes, where it's the ruling as would it rule a wise king. It's a wise king's duty to take care of his subjects, not to rule them, to use them, to oppress them, to enslave them, but rather to rule them as in to will the best for them. Anyway, maybe the second quote's easier for you to remember and use. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. Some translations that's to till, to work, or till, T-I-L-L, and to keep, to take care of it. This one was after the Great Flood. So you remember the story of Noah and the Ark? God established a new covenant with humans, but not just with humans. I now establish my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that was with you. Every living creature of the earth. All of creation is now part of God's protective covenant. That's significant, right? Parables of Jesus that use Jesus talks a lot about stewardship. So there's parables like the rich and foolish man who stores a great wealth of grain. That's bad stewardship. The prodigal son, you all know that story, right? The prodigal son who takes his inheritance and wastes it. He's not taking care of resources. It's bad stewardship. Jesus also does good stewardship. You know the parable of the sower who sows the seed in the good soil and the seed takes root and sprouts. Or the person who wisely builds a house on a solid foundation. And these are examples, metaphors, which point towards good stewardship. And of course, Pope Francis refers to stewardship. This word vocation means a sort of a calling. And religious people, Christian people, talk about stewardship as a vocation because it's so serious. A vocation to be protectors of God's handiwork, it's essential, says Pope Francis. The season of creation statement, which I've quoted down the bottom, that's an ecumenical statement. That means there's different denominations of Christianity getting together to create that statement. Every year there's a period where Christianity as a whole, the different Christian churches pray for creation and try and learn about creation and take steps of action and advocacy about creation. Well, this year, this was their statement. So by listening to the voice of all creation, humans from everywhere can be joined by our vocation to care for our common home. Again, that vocation, that stewardship. So here's what it looks like. I'll do the top and the bottom. The teaching of stewardship guides adherents of Christianity to care for the environment. Christians believe they have a special God-given responsibility as stewards of the created world. Evidence, evidence, evidence. Finishing with the Christian tradition through statements such as the Season of Creation Statement 2022 calls adherents to exercise their stewardship of the environment. Humans from all cultures and sectors of life can be joined by our vocation to care for our common home. All right, so the teaching, what's the so what factor? It makes it clear that humanity has a special responsibility. Of all of God's creation, humanity has got the most special responsibility to make sure that that creation is taken care of. It's part of God's intentional design, a Christian would believe. It's supposed to be like that. We're able to do it because that's the way God wanted us to be. Stewards, so you can't be passive. A Christian would say you can't be passive about your engagement of the world. You're a steward, you have to act like a good king. All right, love of neighbour. Remember I was talking about Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew before? That's him on the right there with Pope Francis. The guys in the back are pretty important as well, some Middle Eastern leaders. Now, this is a little bit sophisticated as well, but it's really good teaching that you can use, especially in your extended responses. So you all know the Christian, the greatest commandment, right? Love the Lord your God and love your neighbour as yourself. Jesus' teaching to love your neighbour as yourself actually does, it's not just about people, it's about the environment too. Well, Christians can take care of their neighbour by making sure that the goods of the environment are preserved, protected for the responsible use of all, including for future generations. I do this teaching a lot, and I'm going to talk about it a little while with regards to climate change, because the big losers out of climate change are not rich people like me living in, you know, buildings, beautifully refurbished buildings in Sydney. The big losers about climate change are poor people. They're the ones who'll be hit first and hardest by the impacts of climate change. More on that later. So here's your evidence that you can use about how loving your neighbour is related to caring for the environment. Use that second quote there. Whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Patriarch Bartholomew explains, along with Pope Francis and Welby, his name is, I think Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Reverend Welby. But we also face a profound injustice. The people bearing the most catastrophic consequences of these abuses, that's environmental abuses, are the poorest on the planet. And they've been the least responsible for causing them. They're not the big polluters, that's us. We serve a God of justice who delights in creation and creates every person in God's image, but also hears the cry of people who are poor. Ecumenism is when the different denominations of Christianity get together to do good in the world. This is both an example of that and of environmental protection. So that's a good one for you guys to learn, because you can use it in multiple parts of the exam. All right, so love of neighbour. Why does it matter? Christians can care for their neighbours who are poor and vulnerable by protecting them from the consequences of environmental destruction. You could add Christians can care for future generations by preserving the environment for them to responsibly live with in the future. Evidence, 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 and then it is clear that Christian ethics advocates an approach to the environment that is focused on the needs of those who are poor. Environmental degradation, such as waste of resources, pollution, rising sea levels, has a disproportionate impact on those who are most vulnerable. Christians can show their love of neighbour by protecting the environment on behalf of the poor. I think that's especially a call to powerful Christians, people, you know, frankly, like the people in our schools, to do more on behalf of less powerful Christians in terms of protecting the environment. All right, so let's just check it. We've done 5 teachings now. It's more than you need. But if you can learn all 5, good on you, you'll do better. So what you'll need to make sure you can do when you go back and study, look at your notes, provide the main features of the teachings. That's simple enough. Start with 1, then work up to 3, and then go for gold. Main features, and then examples for each one. That's where the hard work comes in. There's no way to do the memorization for my limited brain anyway. The only way I've ever been able to memorize something is to just keep doing it. So graft it out, memorize enough evidence so you can support the teachings. And then I actually find this part a bit easier. My students usually do. How the teachings matter in the world. That's the part that it's fun to talk about. It's the evidence, it's the hard work, I think. All right. So in terms of our learning intentions and success criteria that we talked about at the beginning, can you define environmental ethics? Yes, probably could do that before we started. But you could name and define 3 Christian ethical teachings. So if you can say, yeah, definitely stewardship, what was the other one? God is the creator and creation is good, then you're away there. This next bit you're going to need to work towards, quote evidence from scripture or tradition. Let's get into the second half of our success criteria now. So, another great photo from the climate strike from 2019. But that wasn't a Christian thing, even though lots of Christians were there. What do Christians say about climate change, and why do they say it? We're going to consider this issue of climate change through the lens of Christian ethical teachings. We're going to prove that it matters in the world by giving examples from the lived expression of Christianity. So these 3 examples have used those teachings to tackle that issue. Does that make sense? Now, I'm suggesting this, there's lots of different ways you can structure your thinking and your notes and your writing on ethics, but this is one way to look at the issue, how the teachings apply to the issue, and how they're lived out in the world. So I started saying something about this one before, the joint message for the protection of creation. So you can see the 3 crests up the top there. They're the crests of Anglicanism, the leader of Anglicanism, who is the Archbishop of Canterbury, whose name is, as I correctly remember before, Reverend Justin Welby, Archbishop of Canterbury. If you're watching the Queen's Jubilee celebrations, then he was mentioned there. Pope Francis, who's the leader of Catholicism, and the man who I've spoken about before, Patriarch Bartholomew, he's the leader of the Orthodox Church. So this is a great example of ecumenism. And it applies to teachings such as the nature of God as creator, stewardship, love of neighbour, all against the issue of climate change. And it calls on Christians to take action. This statement that was written by these Christian leaders to prepare for a very important United Nations conference called COP, the Conference of Parties, COP or COP26. So COP26 was a United Nations conference that happened last year, 2021, so it's very current. And the leaders of Christianity wanted the delegates to COP, all of these powerful, mostly men from all over the world, to know what Christians all over the world thought they ought to do. You can see their signatures there at the bottom of the document. You could look this document up because it's maybe 2.5 pages long. You can read it in 5 minutes. So it's a good one to look up. So there's a few things about it. You don't need all of this, but you have to have a couple of facts about the document to use. You can see there, I've written, it calls on all Christians to take action against climate change, the document does, but it also calls on leaders of nations to respect the environment, use resources sustainably, and care for those who are poor and vulnerable. All right, so this is going to take a second. And someone asked before, would the recording be available? Yes, it will. The presentation available also, so you can cut and paste this later. I don't even know if it's very good, but maybe you can use it and adapt it to make it good in your context. So here's how I'd put all that together. The impact of environmental ethical teachings on the Christian community can be seen in ecumenical statements such as that one, the 2021 Joint Message for the Protection of Creation. I've said who it's written by, so you need a detail about it. And I've said what it does with the teachings. This statement applies Christian teachings such as the nature of God as creator, stewardship, the love of neighbour, to the issue of climate change. So that whole section there that I've just read, that's all just giving the context. What's the issue? What's the teachings? And what's the application? What's the lived expression? The teaching, now I'm going to give a bit of detail. The teaching that God is the creator of the world is sourced from the Bible, where Paul writes all things were created by him and for him. That would be enough. You could end that quote there. The JMPC implores adherents to respect God's creation by examining their behaviour and pledging meaningful sacrifices for the sake of the earth which God has given us. God's the creator for the sake of the earth which God has created. The statement also refers to their responsibility as stewards. So I'm talking about a second teaching here and how it's evident in the statement, stating that individual and collective responsibility for our God-given endowment is a vital starting point for environmental sustainability. Again, you don't have to learn that whole quote, just get the shortest chunk of it to prove your point. Finally, the statement calls on Christians to love their neighbour by recognising that the people bearing the most catastrophic consequences of these abuses are the poorest of the planet. I think that's a quote you should learn. In these ways, and then a little concluding sentence at the end. All right, so I've scaffolded it out, us. So I sort of had this thesis where I named the teachings, organisation, individual, lived expression, and the issue. Well, the teachings, I said creation, God is the creator, stewardship and love of neighbour were the three that I used. I named the organisation, individual, lived expression, which was that joint statement. The issue, climate change. You can see I'm trying to bring those three worlds together to show that it matters. Then you have to write cause and effect sentences, which you've probably been learning about for a long time with your teachers, where you have to sort of say why it matters. How this organisational statement or how this lived expression has brought the teachings to life. Then you just tag a final statement in the end to make sure you're answering the question. One of the attendees has asked whether it's recommended to include Christian variant perspectives in relation to each ethical theme. So do you always need to present the variant perspectives? The answer is it all depends. So yes, you do, but if you're writing a 20-mark response, you wouldn't have to have illustrations of all the variants in every paragraph. Otherwise, your paragraphs would just be too long. So, but across the whole response, across the whole 20-mark response, I would recommend having or showing that you understand that you're representing the whole of the Christian tradition. This bit of evidence, so I'll just bring my screen back to life. This bit of evidence here is perfect because you're already representing the diversity of Christianity, right? You've got three different variants there. Good question though, thank you for it. So that's my little scaffold that I'm using. This is the same response, but I've just sort of color-coded it out there. So my thesis where I'm going to say what I'm talking about, my section is at the top there. I talk about the statement, give a tiny bit of detail about it, talk about the teachings. And the issue just there at the end of climate change. Then this evidence and effect. That's the big part, and that's where the work is. And then just a tag at the end to make sure you are answering the question. Let's look at another example. So this is another example of a lived expression of how Christianity responds to those teachings, brings those teachings to life in the world. It's called the Pacific Calling Partnership. It's an action of the Edmund Rice Centre. The Edmund Rice Centre has grown out of the organisation that used to be the Christian Brothers. Lots of Catholic schools have got an Edmund Rice Foundation or an Edmund Rice charism. And the Pacific Calling Partnership is part of their good works. You can see here That's a place in the Pacific. It's spelled Kiribati, but you say Kiribati. And the Pacific Calling Partnership is trying to bring people to an awareness and make them do something about the impact that climate change is having on people like the people of Kiribati. So you can see there, if the sea level rises, that is catastrophic for the people of Kiribati. Very bad for their farming, very bad for their drinking water. So if the level of salt water in the soil rises, then the drinking water becomes salinated, I think is the word, becomes salty, unusable. And eventually, I mean, you could see a case where there had to be climate change refugees, where people just couldn't live there anymore. So a rich nation like Australia, Christians would say, would have a responsibility to take care of these refugees. The Pacific Calling Partnership do things like, so I referred to COP26 before, that's the United Nations conference on climate change. It was all about setting emissions targets, getting the big nations, or getting all nations, to set firm targets and commit to them, to bring their targets forward, to take more decisive action. Christianity was very keen on advocating at that conference. One of the great things that the Pacific Calling Partnership did was made sure that people who have got the first-hand suffering at the hands of the impacts of climate change could go to COP. So it wasn't just the leaders of all these powerful places, famous leaders. It was also people who have first-hand impact of climate change. They do this sort of training and mentoring, so exchange programs with people, training people from Australia, and also training in giving them an accurate experience of what's happening, and also training people from the Pacific Islands in the kind of skills that they need to strongly put their arguments about the impacts of climate change. I do media releases. Here's a media release recently from April 2022 about fossil fuel. It's a big issue in the Pacific. Okay, so there's some detail about that, which you can check later. Yeah, definitely for checking later. Putting it all together, so this is the same piece of writing, but it's just sort of coded out. So the teachings of stewardship and love of neighbour are used by Christian individuals and groups to raise awareness and inspire action about environmental issues. That's a good thesis sentence. Use it if you like. This can be seen in the work of Pacific Calling Partnership, the Catholic Australian Environmental Advocacy and Action Group, which focuses on the impact of climate change in the Pacific. I'm saying, bring it together with my thesis statement, my paragraph statement, then just the barest of detail about the lived expression. I'm going to give more evidence and talk about the impact in this middle section here. Rising sea levels could have a devastating impact on the Pacific nations such as Kiribati, including erosion, salinisation, possibly resulting in the island becoming uninhabitable. PCP appeals to countries throughout the Pacific to fulfil their responsibilities as stewards, show care for their neighbours across the Pacific. So you can see I'm using those two quotes because they hit the teachings. Does this by delegates to COP, running training, which I talked about before. And then in the green, in these ways, PCP is a tangible demonstration of the relevance of the environmental ethical teachings to adherents of Christianity. It's the whole, if you can get that happening, here's the teachings, here's where they're from, here's why they're relevant, and an example of why, then you're going to ace this particular component. I'm going to just super quickly go through this one, but someone was asking before about diverse expression. So PCP's Catholic, here's an Anglican expression, the Anglican Communion Environmental Network. They do lots of great works. One of them is this Twitter stream, which is immensely popular, called Green Anglicans. They're tweeting about all sorts of environmental issues, but putting the religious perspective, putting the Anglican, the Christian perspective, putting the Christian teachings out there and proving their relevance to the world. They also do lots of things like, again, they had delegates at COP. They produce notes for their pastors, homily notes. so that people can talk knowledgeably about environmental issues in the context of a church service. Here's another recent tweet about global warming. This was great. This was something that this Anglican Communion did, or led at least, which was the season of creation. Now, I talked about that before. This is another one for you to check out. It's another ecumenical environmental issue. So it involves lots of different branches of Christianity, lots of different denominations working together. The season of creation is all about advocacy about environmental issues, prayer, and sowing seeds of action for environmental, in responding, Christian response to environmental issues. That's an example of one of the works of the Anglican Communion Environmental Network, ACEN. There's some things about it for you to check later. And here again is how to put it together. The ethical teachings that God is the creator and that creation is good help to inform the work of Christian environmental groups such as the ACEN. Evidence, evidence, evidence. And then the concluding statement, the action and advocacy of ACEN demonstrates how Christian environmental ethical teachings are relevant in the lives of adherents. All right, let's talk about some past papers now, just for the last 5 minutes or so. This is a very common structure in section 2. You need to be able to sort of do this by memory. I would, before I went into the exam, it'll reduce your stress in the exam room. If you see a question in this format, you'll be like, yes, it'll just flow out of my pen. The skills are outline into explain. So how does, that part 2 there, how does is an explain question. We need to show evidence. Outline is, well, outline is outline, sketch detail. So outline one ethical teaching, 3 marks. Explain how does the ethical teaching outlined already give guidance to adherence in environmental ethics. Here's how I'd answer. An ethical teaching in Christianity is stewardship. Then you define it. This teaching guides Christians to care for the environment. Then you say where it came from. It is based in scripture where God creates humans and gives them responsibility of all the earth and the creatures that move along the ground. Scripture also teaches that God put the first humans in the Garden of Eden to work and take care of it. Then, just bring it all together with one last sentence. Christians believe they have a special God-given responsibility as stewards of the created world. That's more than enough. Right, so there's your 3-mark structure. I'll put it down the bottom, or it's just what I recommend. So go with your teachers if they recommend something different. This is the way that I do it. State and define, then put your evidence. Okay, here's a 4-mark. Could be maybe a little bit long, but here's how I would do it. I'm just going to skip to the next slide because it's got it scaffolded out. So because explain is the skill, what I would be looking for if I was marking it would be the skill of cause and effect. So showing why things matter. So the question was around how does it give guidance to adherence? So the first thing I want to do is make sure I use the word guide or guidance a number of times in my answer. Can you count them there? I've highlighted them up for you. It gives guidance to adherence. Later on, guides Christian to. Later on, guides Christian to. Later, this guidance is expressed by. Finally, guides adherence. So I'm hitting that word, so I'm making sure that I'm answering the actual question. Then I'm using lots of little effect hinges in my writing to show how it guides adherence. So it helps Christians to recognise that God is the author of all creation as part of their creative plan. Humans are given a special responsibility. Can be seen in ecumenical documents. So again, you see, you're showing the effect, you're showing the impact. This document guides Christians by is a great effect word. Because is another effect word. As a result is another like effect statement. By recognising their vocation to care for our common home. Guides adherence. This guidance is expressed by, I've said later on. And that's my recommendation for the 4 mark there. Last year, this was the essay question. for Christianity. So the goal is not to escape from this world, but it loves the world and seeks to change it for the better. That's a statement. And then the question for 20 marks, how does Christianity encourage adherents to be people who might help to change the world for the better? The first thing that you notice is environmental ethics is not mentioned in the question, but it's implied, right? How does Christianity encourage adherents to change the world for the better? Well, there's lots of different ways you can answer that. You could answer it with practice, you could answer it with your person, but a good way to answer it is to use your ethics. You're not bound to that. There's one way you could do it. All right, so I've just written an introduction. Here's what, if you have trouble writing your introductions, as I do, I use this little scaffold just so that I don't get caught. You don't have to use it, but it's one thing that might help. So my first sentence, I write a general kind of sentence about Christianity, about it being a living tradition. Sometimes I use Christianity is a dynamic living tradition that helps adherents in the world today. And then I get straight into the question. So my first sentence today, love is at the center of Christianity, because the question was asking people, the statement mentioned love. It loves the world. Christianity loves the world and seeks to change it for the better. So love is at the center of Christianity. Jesus directed his followers to love your God and love your neighbor. So it's natural for Christians to express this love by loving the world and aspiring to change it for the better. As I've said there in your second sentence, in the purple on the left, got to start hitting that statement. So you start including the statement. It's imperative that you do that a couple of times in your introduction. I like to do at the start of the introduction and as you can see at the end there. The middle part of the introduction, my introduction, I like to write lists. So put lists of the content you want to talk about. So Christians demonstrate their love for the world, which was out of the statement, by acting to address environmental issues such as, here's a list, climate change, pollution, and animal extinction. These are going to help to shape my paragraphs later on. To address these issues, adherents can turn to the environmental ethical teachings of Christianity, such as, here's another list, nature of God as a creator, goodness of creation, stewardship, love of neighbour. So those lists, if I'm reading that, if I'm marking this, I think, well, this candidate has learned their content, they're able to hit the key points there, they're using a list, and that list is, I bet, going to control their paragraphs later in the response. Then you write a last sentence that links back, make sure you link back to the question and statement. So these teachings are found in the scripture and tradition of Christianity, brought to life through Christian individual and groups who hope to change the world for the better, which was what the question was asking. All right. So with that, that takes us through success criteria 4, talking about environmental issues. 5, explaining and evaluate how Christian groups deal with those. 6, putting all that into some section 2 and 3 answers. Maybe you've got some questions. So if you do, chuck them in the chat now and I'll do my best. Okay, a nice thank you there in the questions. Nothing else. So what I'm going to do is say, please do email me or ask your RACs to get in touch with us here at Mission and Identity if we can help you with anything at all, with any resourcing or any more information. Or if your teachers would like to continue the conversation, I'd love to speak to them about it. Otherwise, all the very best as you are preparing for your trials right now, and good luck with your study over the holidays. Good luck with the trials next term. Signing off now. Good afternoon.